And where do you see Canada right now? Where do you see the US right now in that phase, if we could call it that?
Oh, they're all on the way, and they will all continue to be on the way until they decide not to be and start to resist, because they don't realize right now what's happening, and so they're not taking any steps to counter it.
This episode is brought to you by our Revo Report Patreon. Join our community to get first access to interviews, Bible study guides, devotionals, and prayer books for adults, youth, families, and marriages. Plus, resources on Christian living, leadership, sermon prep, exclusive Q&As, online Bible studies, and even one-on-one coaching or counseling. Visit patreon.com/VinceRevo and grow in faith and truth with us. Historically, a lot of people are looking at Europe right now, they're looking at the UK, they're looking at blasphemy laws. I think even in Canada, there are blasphemy laws. And, when you look at Turkey, for example, that we're studying Revelations, and the book of the letter of Revelation from John had circulated those churches. And those churches were in modern day Turkey. So you see the early church was very present there. And now, obviously, it's mainly an Islamic nation. Where Europe is, where the UK is. Is that historically? Is that how? Are you seeing it play out on how a nation becomes eventually a Islamic state? Do you think the UK one day will become an Islamic state at where it is right now? And where do you see Canada right now? Where do you see the US right now in that phase, if we could call it that?
Oh, they're all on the way, and they will all continue to be on the way until they decide not to be and start to resist, because they don't realize right now what's happening, and so they're not taking any steps to counter it. Now, in Turkey, there were several things that happened that haven't happened in the West. And so it's an imperfect analogy that impedes understanding, because think, well, we haven't been conquered. In Turkey, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, as it's known, they called themselves the Roman Empire, and they lost a big battle in the year 1071 in Manzikert, which is out at the eastern part of what is modern day Turkey. And they lost a massive battle, and the whole Byzantine army was smashed. And the Turks then had no obstacles to occupying the entirety of Asia Minor. Now, the entirety of Asia Minor at that time, this is 1,000 years ago, were populated by Greek Orthodox Christians. And over time, as they were occupied by the Turks imposed the dhimma, the second class status for the non-Muslims, that mandated that the Christians would have to pay the tax, would have to submit to the Muslims, have second class status in the society that would involve not new churches, not rebuilding old churches, not holding authority over Muslims, all these various discriminatory and humiliating regulations. Okay? So over time, the Christians gradually, 1,000 years we're talking, they recognized all they had to do to get out from under all this discrimination that they faced in society was to convert to Islam. And so over time, the vast majority of them did so.
Mm-hmm.
That's unfortunately the case, but that's the case. It's also the case in Egypt and Syria and everywhere else Islam has gone. And so you ended up with this tiny minority of Christians around the Pontus, that is the Black Sea area, south of the Black Sea, and around the West Coast, where my family was from, that was still majority, beginning of the 20th century. And most of the Turks, however, were actually Greeks and Armenians who had converted. And only nowadays, Vince, it's funny, they're finding that out.
Wow.
If you've seen this, but there's an ongoing controversy in Turkey where Turks take those tests, those DNA tests that you get now, where you send, I think you spit on a card or something, you send some of your DNA in and they test you, and they're finding out that they're Greeks and Armenians.
Wow.
And they're shocked. A lot of them are very upset. You can actually see videos of Turks finding out that they're Greeks and being all upset. because all the large have grown up thinking we are the great mighty Muslim Turks who conquered the Greeks and drove them out of Asia Minor. Well, they're not. They're the dhimmis who converted to live a better life. And so it's a massive thing going on all over Turkey, because it turns out the vast majority of the Turks are actually Greeks and Armenians, and not Turks from Central Asia at all. And you can look at them. I've always thought, when I looked at pictures of various Turks, these people look like Greeks. They don't look like Central Asians. You look at Central Asians, and you get pictures of people from Central Asia, Mongols, people from Turkmenistan, and you see they look like Central Asians. They look like they have the eyes of people from Japan and China, but not with the features of people from Japan and China, as if they are people who mixed with people from Japan and China, but from also farther west. And well, that's the Turks, but they're not. Only a small number of the people from Turkey actually look like that. And why is that? Because if you read the actual history, the Ottomans didn't conquer with massive people coming in from Asia. The leaders came in from Asia, the armies came in from Asia, but then they settled down and married the local women. And then their children were Muslims. Or they converted the local people. But they also originally, I have them in a book that's coming out. It's unfortunately not coming out until next year, but I have all this in there, that the Turks did not colonize. They didn't bring in massive numbers of people. They mixed with the locals, which means that the locals, who they are now, all these centuries later, you see. They're of the descent from the Christian people. But anyway, why am I talking about this? Refresh my memory.
That is really interesting. But okay. The second half of that question was, where's Canada now? Where's the U.S. now? Where's Europe right now, in your opinion?
The Europeans have not been invaded, and so they don't have any idea that they've lost a war. But what they did was they opened the gates and they brought in all these people who are Muslims. And now the Muslim people are reproducing at much greater rates than the locals. And so in a few generations or sooner, they're going to have Muslim majorities. And they're going to be conquered without even realizing it, because they don't realize also that the people coming into Europe are not coming in thinking we're going to become Europeans, we're going to become secular Westerners, we're going to become Christians. They're not doing that. They're maintaining their own identity and their own customs, which is only natural because they believe they're the best of people, as the Quran says, and the non-believers are the most vile of created beings. So what else are they going to think? And they come in, they're going to take over, and it's going to be ultimately exactly like modern Turkey, with all these people who may have descent from the original English or the original French or the original Germans, but they're going to be generations down the road raised as Muslims in a Muslim country. And then there'll be a tiny minority of Christians who maintained the faith and refused to convert. And that's absolutely the future of Britain and of Western Europe now. And they are not doing a single thing about it. The only difference, that's the point. I'm sorry, I kind of got a little off track there, but the point I was making was that they weren't conquered like Turkey was, but it'll ultimately end up the same way, that they will end up with a population of Muslims, including a great many people who converted or are the descendants of people who converted. So that if they take their DNA test in 300 years, they'll see, oh, wow, I'm English. I'm not Pakistani. I'm English. And they'll be surprised, like the Turks are now.
Mm-hmm. And do you see Canada and the U.S. also going in that direction?
Yeah, Canada much more than the U.S., because Canada, of course, you're talking about 10 times less the population of the U.S., and so it's a much smaller population and a much larger Muslim percentage. And so it's going to happen much more quickly there. In the U.S., only now are people beginning to wake up like, oh, wow, we have Muslim enclaves, Sharia enclaves in Texas? Who knew? And it's been going on for years. I've been warning about it, but nobody else is. And, people didn't pay any attention because I'm just a racist, bigoted Islamophobe in the popular view. So nowadays they're realizing, oh, this is actually true. This is happening. But still, it's going to be very hard to get anybody moving to do anything about it, because the Muslim groups have done such an effective job of saying it's Islamophobic to be upset about this. And it's even more so in Canada, where you actually have a government official who's the Islamophobia czar, making sure nobody says anything negative about Islam. How can you possibly say, well, we have to worry about Islamic jihad and Islamic demographic conquest? But demographic conquest is a very real thing. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, who was killed some years ago, the dictator of Libya for many years before that, he spoke about conquering Europe by the wombs of our women. And that's what happened. And same thing in Canada. And same thing to a much lesser degree, but it's begun. Whether it will continue or not is an open question, but it's begun in the US as well.